The vault door hadn't been opened in 11 years. Federal investigators stood in silence. Flashlights cut through decades of dust. And what they saw changed everything they thought they knew about the most wanted man in the Western Hemisphere. This wasn't cash. This wasn't product. This was something far more dangerous. Ledgers, photographs, names, judges, governors, generals, decades of leverage, organized with the precision of a man who never planned to run. A man who planned to rule. El Mencho didn't hide his fortune in that vault. He hid his insurance policy. And according to investigators, the moment that door opened, careers began to collapse. Phone calls were made. And somewhere, in a location still unknown, the most powerful cartel leader alive smiled. Because the men who found his secrets were already on his list. If you understand how empires are truly built, not with bullets, but with leverage, hit subscribe now. Drop your country and the time you're watching. Because what comes next changes everything you thought you knew. The property sat at the end of a dirt road. No signs. No fences. Just 12 acres of overgrown farmland in rural Jalisco, surrounded by hills that hadn't seen official government presence in over a decade. To anyone passing by, if anyone ever did, it looked abandoned. Forgotten. A relic from another era. But according to intelligence reports, this location had been flagged for years. Satellite imagery showed occasional vehicle movement. Thermal scans revealed underground heat signatures inconsistent with typical agricultural structures. And yet, no raid had ever been authorized. Until now. The team arrived before dawn. 47 federal agents. 3 armored vehicles. Air support circling at a distance, ordered to maintain silence unless called. They expected resistance. They found none. The main house was empty. Dust covered every surface. Furniture sat beneath white sheets like ghosts of a life once lived. The kitchen still had dishes in the sink, dried, cracked, untouched for what forensic analysts later estimated to be more than a decade. Someone had left in a hurry, and someone had made sure no one came back. The vault was discovered by accident. A young agent, his name was later redacted from official reports, noticed something wrong with the dimensions. The eastern wall of the basement didn't match the exterior foundation measurements. 16 inches. Missing. He knocked on the concrete. Hollow. Within an hour, structural engineers confirmed it. There was a sealed chamber behind the wall. Reinforced. Climate-controlled. Designed to remain hidden for generations. The order came down to breach. And that's when everything changed. The door was steel. 3 inches thick. Biometric lock, disabled, according to technicians, but originally designed for fingerprint and retinal scanning. Whoever built this vault had resources, patience, and above all, something worth protecting. When the door finally opened, the lead investigator stepped inside first. He didn't speak for almost a full minute. Later, in a classified debrief, he reportedly described it as walking into a library. But not a library of books. A library of lives. Filing cabinets lined every wall. Floor to ceiling. Organized. Labeled. Alphabetized. Each drawer contained folders. Each folder contained a name. And each name belonged to someone powerful. Judges. Prosecutors. Military commanders. State governors. Federal officials. Businessmen whose faces appeared on magazine covers. Police chiefs who had publicly sworn to destroy the cartels. Every file contained photographs. Financial records. Recorded conversations. Dates. Locations. Transactions. According to investigators, some of the evidence dated back nearly 20 years. long before CJNG existed as a formal organization. Long before El Mencho became the name that terrified a nation. This archive wasn't recent. It was foundational. The implications hit the team slowly. Then all at once, one agent reportedly recognized a photograph. A judge, still active, shaking hands with a man whose face had never been publicly confirmed. El Mencho. The photograph was dated. Time-stamped. The judge was smiling. That judge, according to public records, had dismissed 3 major cases against CJNG operatives in the past 5 years. Exposed informants. Ruled key evidence inadmissible. And now investigators understood why. Phone calls began within the hour. The lead investigator contacted his superior. His superior contacted Mexico City. Mexico City contacted someone. The chain of command became unclear. What is clear, according to reports that later surfaced through journalistic investigation, is that the operation was immediately reclassified. Access to the vault was restricted. Photographs were confiscated. Agents were reassigned. And the official report, filed 3 weeks later, described the property as containing materials of ongoing investigative interest. Nothing more. The vault, for all legal purposes, had never been opened. But secrets, once seen, cannot be unseen. And the men who walked into that basement, who held those files in their hands, understood something that would haunt them for the rest of their careers. El Mencho hadn't built an army. He had built a web. Every powerful man who had ever taken his money, attended his meetings, or accepted his favors was now trapped, controlled, silenced, not by threats, by evidence. And that evidence sat in a vault for over a decade waiting. Patient, perfectly organized, because El Mencho understood something that brute force could never teach. The most dangerous weapon isn't the one you fire. It's the one they know you're holding. Investigators reportedly spent 6 hours inside the vault before receiving orders to withdraw. 6 hours. Long enough to photograph less than 12% of the contents. Long enough to realize that what they had uncovered could destabilize entire institutions. And long enough to notice one final detail, a detail that none of them could explain. In the center of the room, on a simple wooden table, sat a single leather notebook. No label, no title, just a handwritten inscription on the inside cover. Para cuando vengan. For when they come. El Mencho knew this day would arrive. He had prepared for it. And according to those who understand how power truly operates in territories beyond government control, the vault was never meant to stay hidden forever. It was meant to be found, at exactly the right moment, when the men who opened it would realize, too late, that they weren't exposing El Mencho's secrets. They were activating them. Within 72 hours, the first resignation was announced. A federal prosecutor, 23 years of service, retiring for personal reasons. No investigation, no scandal, just silence. Then another, and another. The quiet purge had begun. And somewhere, in a location that remains unknown to this day, the most wanted man in the Western Hemisphere waited. He had built his empire on blood, but he would protect it with paper. Before he was the most wanted man in the Western Hemisphere, Nemesio Oseguera Cervantes was a ghost. No photographs, no interviews, no public record of his voice. For years, even rival cartels weren't certain he existed. Some believed El Mencho was a myth, a name invented to mask a committee, a council of leaders hiding behind a phantom. They were wrong. He was real, and his invisibility was deliberate. According to investigators who have spent decades tracing his rise, El Mencho understood something that separated him from every cartel leader who came before. Chapo built an empire on logistics and tunnels. The Arellano Felix brothers built theirs on fear and spectacle. Los Zetas built theirs on military precision and public terror. But El Mencho? He built his on information, because he recognized a truth that most men in his position never grasp. Violence creates enemies. Spectacle invites attention. Fear generates resistance. But secrets? Secrets create slaves. The strategy began long before CJNG had a name. In the early 2000s, El Mencho operated as a mid-level figure within the Milenio Cartel. He managed distribution routes, supervised regional operations, solved problems quietly. He was effective, reliable, forgettable, exactly as he intended. While other ambitious men fought for recognition, demanded titles, territory, public respect, El Mencho collected something far more valuable. He collected debts. According to intelligence reports pieced together over years of investigation, his method was almost surgical. He would identify men in positions of influence: judges, police commanders, local politicians, businessmen with government contracts. He would study them, their habits, their vulnerabilities, their vices, and then, always through intermediaries, never directly, he would offer help. A loan when banks refused, a favor when careers stalled, protection when enemies circled. The terms were generous, almost suspiciously so, and the men who accepted rarely understood what they were truly agreeing to. The first payment was always cash. The second was information. Once a man took El Mencho's money, he was asked to provide something small in return. A name, a date, a shipping schedule, a warning about upcoming operations. Nothing dramatic. Nothing that felt like betrayal. Just cooperation. And once that cooperation was documented, recorded, photographed, filed, the relationship changed. The man was no longer a partner. He was property. This is how empires are truly built. Not through conquest, through compromise. El Mencho didn't need to threaten powerful men. He didn't need to intimidate them with violence or parade their failures publicly. He simply needed them to know that somewhere, in a location they would never find, a file existed with their name on it. A file that could end careers, destroy families, invite prosecution, or worse. And as long as that file existed, those men would do exactly as they were told. Quietly, obediently, forever. According to investigators, El Mencho's network of compromised officials grew slowly over 15 years. By the time CJNG formally emerged in 2010, he reportedly controlled relationships with figures across multiple states: Jalisco, Michoacán, Guanajuato, Colima. Even, according to some intelligence assessments, contacts within Mexico City itself. These weren't street-level connections. These were institutional anchors. Judges who could dismiss cases. Prosecutors who could lose evidence. Police commanders who could redirect operations. Military officers who could delay raids by critical hours. And none of them could refuse. Because refusing meant exposure. And exposure meant destruction. The genius of the system was its silence. There were no public threats. No dramatic confrontations. No bodies left as messages for officials who stepped out of line. Just phone calls. Quiet reminders. And compliance. One former prosecutor, speaking anonymously to journalists years later, described it simply. You never saw him. You never heard from him directly. But you always knew he was watching. And you knew that if you ever forgot, the file would appear. In the right hands. At the worst possible moment. That was the architecture of El Mencho's power. Not bullets, leverage. And he never stopped collecting. As CJNG grew, absorbing territory, eliminating rivals, building one of the most powerful criminal organizations in modern history, El Mencho continued his patient work. Every partnership documented, every transaction recorded, every favor tracked with precision that would rival any intelligence agency. He didn't trust loyalty. He considered it a weakness, a temporary emotion that could shift with circumstance. What he trusted was exposure, because exposed men don't betray you. They can't afford to. This is what separated him from those who came before. Chapo was captured 3 times. His face became famous. His voice was recorded in interviews. His lovers wrote books. His sons fought publicly for succession. He was legendary, but legends are vulnerable. El Mencho chose a different path. No photographs leaked. No interviews granted. Even his voice remained unconfirmed for decades. Multiple reward offers, reaching $50 million, produced almost nothing, because the men who could have provided information were already compromised. They couldn't speak. They were in the files too. When investigators finally breached that vault in rural Jalisco, they weren't just discovering evidence. They were discovering the blueprint. 20 years of patient construction. Thousands of names. An entire shadow government built on documented compromise. El Mencho hadn't just corrupted the system. He had become the system. A parallel structure of control that operated beneath the visible institutions of power. Invisible to the public. Unknown to reformers. Untouchable by traditional law enforcement. Because how do you prosecute a network when the prosecutors are part of it? According to those who study cartel evolution, this represents something new. Previous organizations relied on territorial control. Violence. Fear. CJNG relies on integration. They don't fight the state. They inhabit it. And at the center of that strategy, patient, invisible, watching, sits El Mencho, the architect of silence. He understood that true power doesn't announce itself. True power doesn't need to threaten. True power simply exists, quiet, documented, waiting. And when enemies rise against it, true power doesn't strike back with force. It strikes back with truth. The kind of truth that ends careers, destroys reputations, sends powerful men to prison, or worse, exposes them to the very forces they once commanded. El Mencho built his empire on violence, yes, but he protected it with paper. And paper, unlike soldiers, never defects. This is why the vault mattered. This is why its discovery sent shockwaves through institutions that publicly claimed to oppose him. And this is why, according to intelligence analysts who have tracked CJNG for over a decade, El Mencho remains impossible to capture. Not because he's hidden, because exposing him would expose everyone. In the cartel world, men rise and fall with the seasons. Territory changes hands. Alliances shift. Bodies accumulate. But El Mencho understood that there is one constant in any system of power. Everyone has secrets. And the man who controls those secrets controls everything. The files were organized alphabetically. Not by region. Not by date. Not by the nature of the compromise. Alphabetically. By last name. Like a phone directory. Like a corporate database. Like the records of a man who expected his archive to be referenced frequently and needed efficiency. According to investigators who spent those 6 hours inside the vault, this detail disturbed them more than anything else. Because it revealed intention. This wasn't evidence collected haphazardly. This wasn't a paranoid leader hoarding information without purpose. This was a system, designed to be used. The first drawer opened contained names beginning with A. 14 files. Each one represented a person of institutional significance. A judge in Aguascalientes. A federal prosecutor from Mexico City. A military logistics officer stationed in Apatzingán. Photographs accompanied every file. Not surveillance images taken from a distance. Posed photographs. Handshakes. Dinners. Meetings in private locations. The subjects were smiling. They didn't know they were being documented for leverage. They thought they were being honored as partners. According to reports that surfaced through investigative journalism in the years following the vault's discovery, the evidence inside those files followed a consistent pattern. First, initial contact. Usually a financial arrangement. A payment for services rendered. Protection. Information. Access. Second, escalation. Larger payments. Deeper involvement. Requests that moved beyond passive cooperation into active participation. Third, documentation. Every transaction recorded. Every meeting photographed. Every phone call, when possible, captured on audio. And finally, the file. Sealed. Labeled. Stored. Waiting. One file reportedly contained evidence against a sitting federal judge. The photographs showed him at a private residence in Guadalajara. The date stamped on the images corresponded to a weekend when, according to official court records, he was attending a judicial conference in Monterrey. He wasn't in Monterrey. He was meeting with 3 men whose faces investigators immediately recognized from cartel intelligence databases. Known CJNG operatives. Regional coordinators. The file also contained bank records. Transfers from shell companies in Panama to accounts in the Cayman Islands. Accounts that, according to financial investigators, were linked to the judge's extended family. 15 years of payments. 15 years of compromise. 15 years of rulings that, when cross-referenced with CJNG prosecutions, showed a consistent pattern of dismissed cases, suppressed evidence, and released suspects. One man, one file, and he was just the beginning. The military files were reportedly the most extensive. According to intelligence analysts who reviewed portions of the evidence before access was restricted, Mencho had cultivated relationships with officers across multiple branches. Army commanders responsible for regional deployments. Navy intelligence officers with access to operational planning. Federal police coordinators who managed interagency communication. The files didn't just document payments. They documented timing. Raids that were delayed by critical hours, allowing targets to evacuate. Checkpoints that were mysteriously unmanned during specific transport windows. Operations that were compromised before they even launched. And in every case, the responsible officer had a file. A file that explained everything. One investigator, speaking anonymously to journalists months later, described the experience of reading those files. It felt like watching a building collapse in slow motion. Every name I recognized, every institution I trusted, it was all connected. All compromised. And the worst part, we weren't discovering something new. We were discovering something that had been operating for decades. Right in front of us. We just never saw it. He was reassigned 3 weeks after the vault operation. No explanation given. The political files were handled differently. According to reports, investigators were ordered to segregate any files containing names of elected officials. These were sealed immediately, transported separately, processed through a chain of custody that, notably, bypassed standard evidentiary protocols. What those files contained has never been officially disclosed. But sources within the investigation reportedly indicated that the names included current and former governors, federal legislators, at least one individual who had held cabinet-level position within the national government. These were not distant connections. These were architects of policy, decision-makers who shaped the very laws meant to combat organized crime. And they were in El Mencho's files. Documented, photographed, compromised. The implications paralyzed the investigation. According to sources who spoke on condition of anonymity, senior officials faced an impossible calculation. Prosecuting the individuals in those files would require exposing the evidence. Exposing the evidence would reveal the depth of institutional compromise. And revealing that compromise would undermine public faith in every judicial decision, every military operation, every political statement made about combating cartels for nearly 2 decades. The choice was clear. Suppress. Contain. Silence. And that's exactly what happened. Within weeks, the vault operation was reclassified. Agents who had participated were transferred to unrelated assignments across the country. Some took early retirement. Others received promotions that moved them far from any cartel-related investigations. The official narrative simplified everything. A property was searched. Materials were recovered. The investigation continues. Nothing about the alphabetized files. Nothing about the photographs. Nothing about the names. Especially not the names. But silence doesn't erase truth. It only delays it. According to investigators who have continued tracking CJNG operations, the vault's discovery created an immediate shift within the organization. Communications protocols changed. Money flows were redirected through new channels. Key operatives were relocated. El Mencho knew. Somehow, through sources that remain unidentified, he knew that his archive had been breached. And rather than panic, he adapted. Because the vault was never his only copy. Intelligence analysts believe that multiple archives exist. Redundancies. Backups. Distributed across locations that remain unknown. The vault in Jalisco was significant. But it wasn't singular. El Mencho didn't survive decades at the highest levels of cartel power by keeping all his leverage in one location. He built systems, fail-safes, layers of protection that ensure his information survives even if one archive is compromised. The men in those files, the judges, the generals, the politicians, understood this. Their exposure didn't depend on one vault. It depended on El Mencho's will. And as long as he remained free, as long as his organization continued operating, that exposure remained suspended. A threat. Permanent. Inescapable. This is the true nature of the files. Not evidence for prosecution. Insurance against betrayal. Every powerful man whose name appeared in that vault knew, or quickly learned, that his survival depended on El Mencho's survival. If El Mencho falls, the files release. If CJNG is dismantled, the archives open. If the man at the center is finally captured, everyone burns with him. It's the perfect system. Mutually assured destruction. Applied not to nations, but to individuals. The judges who might convict him are compromised. The prosecutors who might charge him are documented. The military commanders who might locate him are implicated. And the politicians who might authorize decisive action. They're in the deepest files of all. El Mencho didn't just build an empire. He built a hostage situation. And every powerful figure in those alphabetized drawers understood exactly what they were. Prisoners. Trapped not by walls. By paper. Names that should never be written. Names that were written anyway. Names that now ensure the most wanted man in the Western Hemisphere remains protected by the very institutions sworn to destroy him. The first resignation came 17 days after the vault was opened. No press conference. No public statement. Just a brief notice buried in administrative bulletins. A federal prosecutor. 23 years of service. Retiring immediately for personal health reasons. No investigation preceded the departure. No scandal followed it. He simply vanished. His caseload was redistributed. His office was reassigned. Within a month, it was as if he had never existed. And no one asked questions, because asking questions had become dangerous. The second resignation came 4 days later. A military colonel, decorated, respected, positioned within a strategic planning division that coordinated counter-cartel operations across 3 states. His departure was framed as routine. Early retirement, pension secured, 30 years of honorable service concluded without incident. But according to sources who tracked military personnel movements, he didn't retire to his family home in Sonora. He relocated to Guatemala. Quietly, quickly, without his family. A man who had spent 3 decades in uniform, running. By the end of the second month, 11 officials had departed their positions. Prosecutors, judges, police coordinators, military officers, different agencies, different regions, different ranks. But one pattern connected them all. Every name that surfaced in those early departures corresponded to a file recovered from the vault. Someone was cross-referencing. Someone was identifying the exposed. And someone was giving them a choice. According to intelligence analysts who later reviewed the pattern, the departures followed a specific logic. The most compromised individuals, those with extensive documentation, left first. Immediately, without negotiation. These were men whose files contained irrefutable evidence. Photographs, financial records, recorded conversations. For them, there was no path forward, only escape. The moderately compromised followed within weeks. Those whose involvement was significant but potentially deniable. They were offered transfers, reassignments, positions far from cartel investigations, promotions in some cases, because removal was cleaner than exposure. And the least compromised? They remained, watched, evaluated. Some proved their continued usefulness. Others simply waited, uncertain whether their files had been recovered, uncertain whether their names would surface next. That uncertainty was itself a weapon. The purge operated in complete silence. No arrests, no trials, no public accounting, just administrative adjustments, personnel transitions, bureaucratic shuffling that attracted no media attention. To the outside world, nothing had changed. To those inside the system, everything had shifted. According to one source, a mid-level official who spoke anonymously to investigative journalists, the atmosphere within federal law enforcement transformed overnight. Everyone was watching everyone. You didn't know who had seen the files. You didn't know who was compromised. You didn't know if your own name was in there somewhere. And worst of all, you didn't know who was conducting the purge. Was it the government cleaning house? Was it CJNG eliminating liabilities? Or was it both, working together? The ambiguity was paralyzing, and perhaps intentional. Some officials fought back. According to reports, at least 3 individuals attempted to expose the vault's contents through unofficial channels. One contacted a journalist known for cartel investigations. The journalist received a package containing partial documents, photocopies of files, financial records, fragments of evidence. The story never published. The journalist relocated to Spain within 2 weeks. No explanation provided. Another official, reportedly a prosecutor with access to the vault evidence, attempted to transmit files to international law enforcement agencies. According to intelligence assessments, those files never arrived. The prosecutor was found dead in his vehicle outside Zapopan. Official cause: cardiac arrest. No autopsy was requested. No investigation launched. He was 51 years old. No history of heart disease. The third attempt came from a military officer who believed his chain of command was compromised. He contacted American counterparts directly. DA liaisons. FBI attaches. According to sources who tracked the subsequent events, the officer was arrested within 72 hours. Not by American authorities, by his own. The charges: mishandling classified materials, unauthorized communication with foreign agencies, conduct unbecoming. He remains in military detention. No trial date has been set. The message was clear. The files were not for sharing. The purge was not for questioning. And anyone who attempted to disrupt the process would be handled quietly, efficiently, permanently. What made the purge so effective was its ambiguity. No one knew who was conducting it. If it was government officials protecting themselves, then the state had become the cartel's enforcement arm. If it was CJNG operatives eliminating compromised assets, then the cartel had penetrated every level of institutional security. And if it was both, a coordinated effort between compromised officials and cartel leadership, then the distinction between state and criminal organization had collapsed entirely. All three possibilities were equally terrifying, and all three were equally plausible. According to investigators who continued monitoring the situation, the purge achieved its objective within 4 months. Every individual whose file contained significant evidence had been removed, relocated, or silenced. The investigation into the vault stalled. Key witnesses disappeared. Evidence chains broke. The files themselves, those alphabetized records of decades of compromise, were reclassified to a level that effectively guaranteed they would never surface in any prosecution. Case closed. Not through resolution, through erasure. And throughout this process, Mencho remained invisible. No statements, no claims of responsibility, no public acknowledgement that anything had changed. He didn't need to announce his victory. His silence was the announcement. The system had protected itself, which meant it had protected him. Because he was no longer separate from the system. He was the system. The quiet purge demonstrated something that analysts still struggle to articulate. Traditional law enforcement assumes a separation between state and criminal organization. Us and them. Legal and illegal. Authority and opposition. But the vault revealed a different reality. The lines had dissolved. Compromised officials weren't infiltrators. They were institutions. Cartel operations weren't external threats. They were integrated functions. And removing that integration would require dismantling not just CJNG, but the very structures meant to oppose it. No government can prosecute itself. No institution can expose its own compromise without collapsing. Mencho understood this. He had built his empire not against the state. He had built it inside the state. And now, when the state moved to threaten him, it discovered that threatening him meant threatening itself. The quiet purge was not an act of cartel aggression. It was an act of institutional self-preservation. Powerful men protecting their secrets. Systems protecting their legitimacy. And in the process, protecting the man whose files made all of it possible. For months after the vault was opened, official reports indicated that the investigation had achieved its preliminary objectives and was being transitioned to long-term monitoring status. Translation: nothing would happen. The files would remain sealed. The names would remain protected. And Mencho, the architect of silence, would remain free. Not because authorities couldn't find him, because finding him was no longer the goal. Containing him was. And the quiet purge had proven one thing beyond any doubt. Containment meant cooperation. There is a photograph. One photograph, grainy, distant, possibly decades old, that intelligence agencies believe shows Nemesio Oseguera Cervantes. A man in his 40s. Dark hair. Unremarkable features. Standing in what appears to be a rural setting. No context. No timestamp. No confirmation. For years, this single image represented everything authorities knew about Mencho's physical appearance. One photograph. $50 million in reward money. And a ghost who refused to materialize. According to investigators who have spent careers tracking CJNG, Mencho's invisibility is not accidental. It is doctrine. While other cartel leaders cultivated public personas, Chapo's interviews, the Arellano Felix brothers' nightclub appearances, even the Zetas' theatrical violence, Mencho understood that visibility is vulnerability. Every photograph is a data point. Every recording is evidence. Every public appearance is an opportunity for identification, surveillance, and eventual capture. So he chose absence. Complete. Systematic. Absolute. His voice remained unconfirmed for over a decade. Intelligence agencies possessed recordings they believed contained his speech. Intercepted phone calls. Messages relayed through intermediaries. But confirmation required comparison, and comparison required a verified sample, which did not exist. Mencho had never been recorded in any official context. No arrests, no court appearances, no interrogations. The man had operated at the highest levels of international organized crime for 20 years, and left almost no verifiable trace of his existence. This invisibility extended to his operational methods. According to intelligence assessments, Mencho rarely communicated directly with subordinates. Orders passed through layers. Intermediaries. Trusted lieutenants who themselves communicated through additional buffers. No phone calls from the leader. No written instructions. No digital footprint. Information flowed outward in carefully controlled streams. And information flowed inward through channels that only he controlled. The vault demonstrated this architecture perfectly. Mencho didn't collect those files personally. He didn't attend the meetings. He didn't photograph the compromised officials. He built systems that collected for him. Networks of informants. Surveillance teams operating independently. Financial trackers monitoring transactions across multiple jurisdictions. Information arrived at the center. Processed. Organized. Filed. And the man at the center, Mencho, saw everything, while remaining unseen himself. According to analysts who study CJNG's command structure, this created an asymmetric advantage that authorities have never overcome. Mencho knows who his enemies are. He knows their vulnerabilities, their connections, their secrets. But his enemies know almost nothing about him. His locations rotate constantly. His security protocols rival those of intelligence agencies. His inner circle, the handful of individuals with direct access, are themselves isolated from broader organizational knowledge. Even if one lieutenant is captured, one cell is compromised, one network is exposed, the center remains protected. Because the center exists outside the visible structure. Watching, processing, deciding, but never appearing. There is a concept in intelligence analysis, the panopticon, a structure where a single observer can watch all subjects without being seen themselves. The subjects know they are being observed. They modify their behavior accordingly. But they never know when, specifically, they are being watched. Mencho built a criminal panopticon. Every official whose name sits in those files understands they are observed. Every transaction is potentially documented. Every relationship is potentially compromised. But they never know exactly what he knows. What evidence exists. When it might be deployed. That uncertainty is the mechanism of control. According to sources who have studied his methodology, Mencho's patience is his most distinctive characteristic. He doesn't react impulsively to threats. He waits. When rivals encroach on territory, he doesn't immediately counterattack. He gathers information, studies patterns, identifies vulnerabilities. When authorities launch operations against his organization, he doesn't panic. He observes their methods, notes which units are involved, tracks which commanders lead the efforts. And then weeks, months, sometimes years later, he responds. Precisely, devastatingly, without warning. The vault itself was an expression of this patience. Those files weren't collected in a frenzy. They weren't assembled reactively. They were built over decades. Slowly, methodically. A payment here, a photograph there, a recorded conversation, a documented transaction. Each piece individually insignificant. Together, overwhelming. Mencho understood that time is a weapon. Enemies rise quickly and fall quickly. But empires, true empires, are built across generations. According to intelligence reports, his strategic planning extends far beyond immediate operations. CJNG's expansion into new territories follows patterns that suggest years of preliminary groundwork. Relationships cultivated long before territorial moves. Officials compromised before operations begin. Infrastructure established before products flow. By the time CJNG visibly enters a new market, the invisible work has already been completed. The territory is already his. The announcement simply confirms what was decided years earlier. This is what makes him different. Chapo was brilliant at logistics, moving product across borders with unprecedented efficiency. The Zetas were brilliant at violence. Military precision applied to territorial control. But Mencho is brilliant at architecture, building systems that operate independently, creating structures that sustain themselves, establishing control that persists beyond any individual operation, any specific territory, any single moment in time. He builds things that last. According to those who have analyzed his organization, CJNG functions less like a traditional cartel and more like a corporation. Decentralized operations, regional autonomy, performance-based advancement. Information flows upward, resources flow downward, and at the center, invisible but omnipresent, sits the architect. He doesn't need to control every decision. He designs the systems that shape every decision. And then he watches those systems operate, adjusting, refining, perfecting. The files in the vault were part of this design. Compromised officials weren't individual relationships. They were infrastructure. A judge in one state, a prosecutor in another, a military commander in a third. Each one a node in a network that extended across the entire country. Each one connected to the center, documented, controlled, and each one, through their own compromised position, recruiting others, expanding the network, deepening the integration, until the system became self-sustaining. This is what authorities discovered when they opened that vault. Not just evidence, a blueprint, a diagram of institutional capture that explained how one organization could operate with such impunity across such vast territories. And at the center of that diagram, mentioned in every connection, implied in every transaction, present in every strategic decision, sat a man whose face remained unknown. El Mencho, the Watcher, the architect, the man who built a criminal empire not through presence, but through absence. According to intelligence analysts, this represents the evolution of organized crime. Previous generations of cartel leaders were warriors. They fought, they killed, they conquered. El Mencho is different. He is an administrator, a designer of systems, a collector of leverage. He doesn't need to fight because his enemies are already compromised before conflict begins. He doesn't need to appear because his systems operate without his visible intervention. He doesn't need to threaten because the files speak for themselves. And somewhere, in a location that remains unknown despite $50 million in reward money and the combined efforts of multiple international agencies, he continues watching, processing information, updating files, adjusting strategies. The vault was opened. Its contents were seized. But El Mencho adapts. New files are being compiled. New relationships are being documented. New officials are being compromised. The system continues. Because the system was designed to continue. With or without any single vault. With or without any single operation. With or without any single individual. The architecture persists. And the architect watches. The case against CJNG was supposed to be transformative. Dozens of agencies. Billions in resources. International cooperation spanning 3 continents. The vault discovery was meant to accelerate everything. Finally, evidence. Documentation. Proof of the networks that had been suspected for decades. Instead, the case stalled. Witnesses recanted. Evidence chains fractured. Key officials retired, transferred, or simply stopped cooperating. Within 18 months, the investigation that was supposed to dismantle the most powerful cartel in the Western Hemisphere had quietly collapsed into administrative limbo. No major prosecutions. No strategic victories. No meaningful impact on CJNG operations. And El Mencho, the primary target of $50 million in reward money, remained exactly where he had always been. Invisible. Untouchable. Watching. According to analysts who study cartel prosecutions, the vault case represents a turning point. Not a victory for law enforcement. A lesson. The lesson is simple. Some organizations become too integrated to prosecute. Not too powerful. Not too violent. Not too well defended. Too integrated. When the lines between criminal enterprise and legitimate institution dissolve completely, traditional law enforcement mechanisms cease to function. You cannot prosecute what you cannot separate. And CJNG, under El Mencho's patient architecture, had become inseparable from the systems meant to destroy it. The files in that vault didn't just document corruption. They documented dependency. Judges whose careers depended on cartel money. Prosecutors whose safety depended on cartel protection. Military commanders whose operations depended on cartel intelligence. Politicians whose elections depended on cartel funding. Remove any single individual, and another compromised figure fills the position. Remove an entire network, and the institutions themselves collapse. The choice facing authorities was never prosecution or impunity. It was prosecution or stability. And stability won. According to intelligence assessments compiled after the vault operation, CJNG's territorial control actually expanded during the period when the investigation was supposedly at its most intense. New plazas in Guanajuato. Expanded presence in Baja California. Deeper penetration into Mexico City operations. While federal resources focused on processing vault evidence and managing the quiet purge, CJNG continued its strategic expansion. Almost as if the investigation itself was a distraction. Almost as if El Mencho had planned for this exact scenario. Because he had. According to analysts who have studied his methodology, El Mencho understood that investigations follow predictable patterns. Initial discovery creates urgency. Urgency generates resource allocation. Resource allocation creates bureaucratic processes. Bureaucratic processes create delays. And delays create opportunities. The vault was never meant to remain secret forever. Its discovery was inevitable, perhaps even intentional. What mattered was what happened after. And what happened after was exactly what El Mencho anticipated. Chaos, confusion, institutional paralysis. The perfect conditions for expansion. The empire's true foundation was never territory. It was never product. It was never even the files themselves. The foundation was understanding. El Mencho understood systems. How they function. How they fail. How they can be manipulated. He understood that institutions protect themselves above all else. He understood that powerful men will sacrifice principles to preserve positions. He understood that the threat of exposure creates more compliance than the reality of violence. And he built his empire on these understandings. Systematically. Patiently. Perfectly. According to sources who continue monitoring CJNG operations, the organization today is stronger than it was before the vault was discovered. Revenue streams have diversified. International partnerships have expanded. Political relationships have deepened. The investigation that was supposed to weaken them demonstrated their resilience instead. To potential rivals, the message was clear. Even direct federal attention cannot threaten El Mencho's network. To potential partners, the message was equally clear. Alignment with CJNG means alignment with the winning side. To compromised officials, the message was clearest of all. Your files remain secure, as long as your loyalty remains secure. The vault operation didn't damage El Mencho's empire. It advertised it. And what of the man himself? According to the most recent intelligence assessments, El Mencho remains operational. Health concerns have circulated for years. Rumors of kidney disease, mobility issues, declining stamina. Some analysts believe he has reduced his direct involvement in daily operations. But reduced involvement is not absence. The architecture he built doesn't require his constant attention. Systems run themselves. Compromised officials maintain their positions. Files continue accumulating. The empire persists. His children have assumed greater operational responsibility. His son, known as El Menchito, was captured in 2014, but the organization barely wavered. His daughter was arrested in connection with financial operations, but the money continued flowing. CJNG was designed to survive the loss of any individual component, including, perhaps, El Mencho himself. This is the final lesson of the vault. The empire's true foundation is not a person. It is a design, a way of organizing power that transcends any individual leader. Compromised institutions, documented leverage, integrated operations. These things persist beyond any single lifetime. El Mencho will eventually die. Through capture, through illness, through the inevitable passage of time. But the systems he built will not die with him. The files will remain. The relationships will continue. The architecture will persist. Because empires built on leverage don't require emperors. They require only the threat of exposure. And that threat is permanent. According to those who study the evolution of organized crime, CJNG represents something unprecedented. Not the most violent cartel. The Zetas claim that distinction. Not the most profitable. That title shifts with market conditions. But perhaps the most sustainable. An organization designed not for immediate dominance, but for generational persistence. Mencho didn't build a cartel. He built an institution. And institutions, unlike individuals, do not easily disappear. The vault in rural Jalisco has been sealed. Its contents remain classified. The officials whose names appeared in those files continue their careers. Diminished perhaps, but protected. The investigation has been archived. And somewhere, in a location that intelligence agencies have spent decades failing to identify, the most wanted man in the Western Hemisphere continues his work. Not fighting, not fleeing, simply continuing. Because the empire doesn't require his presence. It only requires his design. And his design is already complete. This is the story that authorities will never publicly acknowledge. Not a tale of law enforcement triumph. Not a narrative of justice prevailing. A reality of systems too integrated to dismantle. Of compromises too deep to expose. Of leverage too powerful to overcome. Mencho understood something that his predecessors never grasped. The goal is not to defeat the system. The goal is to become the system. And in this, he succeeded completely. The vault changed everything. Not because of what it exposed. Because of what it protected. An empire built on paper. A throne built on silence. A legacy that will outlast its architect. The most wanted man in the Western Hemisphere has never been captured. And according to those who truly understand how power operates in territories beyond government control, he never will be. Not because he cannot be found, because finding him would require exposing everyone who protected him. And that list is simply too long.